history of this past century reflects the history of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, of this city, and of the world. It's full of ups and downs, driven by vivid characters, enlivened by constant debate, from the Council's birth in 1922 as a worldly outpost in a provincial hotbed of isolationism, to its status today as a major institution in a leading global city. In the beginning, the Council fostered dialogue on American participation in World War II, and after, over the nation's new dominant role in the world. As a forum, it was shaped by and shaped discourse on the Cold War, Vietnam, 9/11, and a return to calls for considering America first. Speakers featured on the Council stage include the men and women who define the century. As it evolved into a think tank, the Council expanded its focus and now leads in examining trends in public opinion on global issues, advancing policy solutions for global food security, and elevating the role of global cities in world affairs. The world, Chicago, and the Council have changed over this past century, but our mission remains the same. We believe with access to fact-based and balanced views, you, the people in America's heartland and throughout this extraordinary nation, can help ensure effective U.S. engagement to support a more inclusive, equitable, and secure world. Join us. Be part of the conversation. Together, we can shape our second century.
Hello and welcome. I'm Ivo Dalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Tonight, we begin a month-long celebration to mark the Council's centennial anniversary early in 2022. Over the next few months, we will have an opportunity to look back at our history over these past 100 years. The history of our engagement in the world seen through the lens of one of the oldest public affairs institutions in the United States. While much has changed in those 100 years, the fundamental purpose that prompted the formation of the Council back in 1922 is still essential today. Then and now, the Council has helped people understand what is happening in the world and why it matters to them. Founded on the idea of countering isolationism within the growing global city of Chicago, the Council still aims to share with the public the importance of staying involved in world affairs. To explore the connections between then and now, we are launching a 4-part series entitled A Century of Global Leadership. We will start this series with a deep dive into our own history, based on a new book of the Council that has just been published. We will also look at the rise and fall of isolationism in the interwar period, at the Cold War and its aftermath, and we'll take a special look at the role of women as global leaders. This series is made possible by the incredible generosity of our sponsors, an engaged and diverse group of supporters who are committed to ensuring everyone can participate in the global conversation that affects all of us. We're grateful for their persistent and unwavering support. The full list of sponsors is available on our website, and I hope that you will all consider investing in our work as we look forward to our next century. Tonight, we'll be sharing stories from the Council's very own history, how it has guided Chicago's view of the world, how the world has engaged Chicago, and how our own national history over these years has been shaped by the Council itself. We're pleased to have with us two people who have lived and thought a good deal about the history of our city and of our Council. Richard Longworth, a distinguished fellow at the Council, has devoted his journalistic talents to write a superb history of the Council entitled Chicago and the World. With his keen reporter's eye, he combed the archives and interviewed scores of people to tell a vivid tale of the Council's 100-year history and the historical events that shaped its work for a century. For many years before his association with the Council, Dick was a foreign correspondent and reporter at UPI and the Chicago Tribune. He's won the Overseas Press Club Award twice, and he was a 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. I want to give a special thanks to Bruce and Martha Clinton, Bob and Susan Arthur, Pat and Ron Miller, and to Adele Simmons for their generosity that made this book possible. Joining Dick today is another award-winning reporter, Carol Marin. Carol was the political editor at NBC5 News in Chicago, as well as a regular contributor on WTTW's Chicago Tonight. She also worked for CBS's 60 Minutes, and most recently, she's been the director of DePaul's Center for Journalism Integrity and Excellence. Thank you all again for joining us and supporting our mission. And with that, I'll hand the reins over to Carol, our moderator for this evening.
And as Stevenson said, I was a dirty dog in the Tribune in the morning and a shining hero in the Daily News by night.
In your book, you talk about Midwesterners being ignorant largely of foreign affairs, right? And yet, I'm curious how we square the fact that if there was this lack of interest, how thousands of people packed council events when there were key leaders coming to address the council. There obviously was a hunger and a thirst somewhere in this land.
Yeah, these were people who weren't getting information, who were ignorant on this, didn't want to be ignorant. They wanted to hear about it and hear it with these council meetings. And you're right, in the days leading up to World War II, crowds of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people were not uncommon. And then the council started broadcasting its meetings and reaching audiences around the Midwest of some 200,000 people. The council in those days took it upon itself really to educate Midwesterners and Chicagoans about what was going on in Europe, about what was leading up to the war, about the plight of Jews in Europe before this became general knowledge. Speakers like Edward R. Murrow and other correspondents came. Ambassadors like William Dodd came. We had the top people came in and people poured out to hear them because this was news from the front and they really wanted it.
Go back to this nonpartisan but neutral thing, because when I read it the first time and then when I read it, different chapters of this, it's a pretty hard negotiation to be nonpartisan but neutral, isn't it? I mean, was the council really indeed neutral? And was it nonpartisan?
No, it is nonpartisan but not neutral. The council believes in an openness to the world. It believes in an engagement to the world, a positive engagement. Since World War II and all the post-war years, it's believed in alliances. There are certain parts of foreign policy that are sort of the council's religion. There are things that we do believe that we foster. There's another side of the coin, the isolationist coin, that says we don't want to have anything else to do with the rest of the world. Or the exceptionalist side, which says the rest of the world is evil, so we're going to go out and fix it. The council tries to come down the middle of this, but it's a responsible, open approach to the rest of the world. And on that, we are not neutral. Nonpartisan, we don't endorse candidates. We don't say to senators, you ought to vote for this bill or that. But
isn't there a kind of de facto piece of this that if you believe in the rightness of a policy, it ends up sometimes hearkening on the Democratic or the Republican side?
It hasn't been much of a problem until the Trump election. And suddenly we found there was an American foreign policy that really was pretty much opposite everything the council believed in and taught. And so, yes, that did stretch it. A lot of the programs were anti-Trump. The fact is, over the years, and it's odd, we've had a very hard time getting more conservative, more Republican speakers. Democrats and liberals are much more willing to speak to the council, to the point that the council for years had this reputation, even though it's something of an elite organization in Chicago, it had this reputation of being a leftist organization. We were even investigated by the Red Squad of the Chicago cops back in those days and ended up with our own dossier, right along next to other subversives like Planned Parenthood or the United Methodist Church.
Have you read your dossier? You talk about Adlai Stevenson, and one of the interesting stories you tell in the book is how he lamented that in the early days, the council was being reported upon on the society pages, not on the news pages. Will you tell that story?
This goes back to something that dates to the council's early days. The role of women in the council has always been very important. The two founders of the council were Susan Hibbard and her brother-in-law, William B. Hale. And the first meeting in February of 1922 was 23 people, 12 women, 11 men. Susan Hibbard was the first vice president of the council. Women have always been very active in the council. Louise Wright, who took over from your father-in-law in 1942, was the first executive director of any World Affairs Council in the United States. So women have always been very active. Granted, it did take something like 96 years before a woman, Leah Zell, became the chair of the board. But we have to think that the New York Council on Foreign Relations had to wait 50 years before it even admitted women to membership. But the thing was, a lot of the early meetings were in hotels like the Stevens, now the Hilton, and the Palmer House, and they were luncheons. And they were attended by the sort of people who could afford to spend 2 hours over lunch. They're very chic. They became society affairs, and they began to be covered more by the society pages, which newspapers had in those days, than by the news pages. And Adlai Stevenson noticed this, and it really got his goat. And in a couple of speeches, he said that he wished the newspapers would treat the council meetings like the news events they were, rather than society events. And in a bit, he got a rather snippy letter back from a society writer at the Daily News named Mary Welsh, who said, "What are you complaining about? We're giving you this publicity, and this enables you to get more people out. You're biting the hand that feeds you." And I found her letter, and Stevenson has scrawled across the top. He said, "This is the worst crock yet." But he wrote back a much more diplomatic letter. And there's no sign that Mary Welsh ever responded, but we know from her own memoirs that she herself was getting sick and tired of society news and plotting the rest of her career, which led to her becoming a foreign correspondent and eventually the fourth and final wife of Ernest Hemingway.
You say women were very important to the council, and yet when you talk about Louise Leonard Wright, you also say she got a very condescending welcome as the executive director in 1942. Her hat from Paris was remarked upon, not her foreign policy chops.
This was the attitude back in those days. It's women have never had it easy, but the condescension is absolutely the right word. She was treated more as the wife of Professor Quincy Wright down at the University of Chicago than as the scholar and activist that she was in her own right.
How good was the council about incorporating Jews into its membership?
Very good. I think right from the start. In the 30s, two of the presidents, Walter Lichtenstein and Meyer Kestenbaum, were Jewish, and there's always been Jewish members. One of the first speakers to the council, I might mention, was W.E.B. Du Bois. This is not to say that there's been a big black membership of the council over the years, but the council has been open. A lot of the early speakers were women also, but there were any number of Jewish members, and the attention was paid. We make you hear now that we didn't know until after World War II just what the plight of Jews in Europe was. Well, we had all sorts of programs on that back in the 30s, saying that the Nazis were rounding up the Jews. Walter Lichtenstein, who not only is Jewish but was a German-born Jew, insisted that all points of view be heard. This gets back to what you were talking about, the non-partisanship or the neutrality. He insisted that all points of view be heard, including apologists for the Japanese and a couple of out-and-out Nazis who came here and gave absolutely shocking speeches that nearly caused riots. But the council believed in having all points of view. Speakers arguing the America First or the isolationist point of view appeared on the council stage. One former president of the council, Clay Judson, was very active in America First. So this argument really split everything, including the council, down the middle.
So when it comes to the council, is it a fair criticism or observation that it was largely Eurocentric for too long?
I think so, and this, most of the people who formed the council were of European heritage. They've traveled to Europe. There was less knowledge of Asia. We had leading speakers on Asia, including Pearl Buck and other speakers coming in, but the emphasis was on Europe, and certainly when the Cold War began, that continued. This swung quite a lot, of course, during the 1960s with Vietnam, when there were active debates on Vietnam on the council stage. But over the years, yes, the council, I think by virtue of its membership, by virtue of the nature of the Chicago population at that time, and most of the Midwest, did look more towards Europe.
You had speakers who were utterly galvanizing, sometimes unexpectedly galvanizing. And one of those speakers that you talk about is Robert McNamara, who here he is the architect of Vietnam. He's assuring the American public that the war is a success, and then comes to the council and does what?
I was there that night, so I remember that program. He had written a book, which was a mea culpa, an apology, very heartfelt, heart-rending, over everything that he got wrong in Vietnam, how they really messed up Vietnam and the damage that it caused. And he was on the council stage. And I remember almost in tears talking about this, because he's practically destroyed by this knowledge, by the realization that he had known that the war was going badly and didn't stop it. But then he gave a number of maxims to keep out of this. I wish I could remember, there were 11 of them, I wish I could remember them, but it was things like a simple ignorance of the nature of the enemy, of the Viet Cong, a failure to realize the power of nationalism, the thought that this would lead to dominoes toppling other governments there, just the fact that the administrative branch, the executive branch of the American government is not geared to fight that sort of a war. A number of these things, which were, in retrospect, of course, but very wise and very apropos. And I remember thinking later that if we had written down McNamara's maxims and tacked them on the wall of every decision maker in Washington, we might not have gotten into Afghanistan, or certainly would not have gotten into Iraq the way we did. McNamara, in the end on this, after a lifetime of being wrong, was right on this, but we didn't pay any attention.
And that moment on the stage, I mean, it must have been not just what he said, but how he said what he said, that is powerful in ways that I think the council achieves something that very few forums are able to achieve, which is that sense of a policy gone wrong and a policy leader realizing it too late.
The council has this unique status. Most the think tanks on the East Coast, Brookings, New York Council, those are really elite organization, members only. There's another organization called the Foreign Policy Association in New York, which is open to the public and puts on public programs. The council does both. We're both a think tank and this public forum. But the council is a place where people, when they come to stand on stage or talk to people, they're not talking to other foreign policy experts. They're not talking about what went wrong in this policy or that policy. They're talking to the public, to the people who literally had to pay for this. And there's an immediacy there and an intimacy that you don't get sitting around a hollow table in Washington.
When we look at 9/11, an anniversary we just observed, the 20th year, how did 9/11 end up reorganizing or repurposing or in some way affecting the council here?
In a major way. Marshal Bhutan had just taken over as the council president, literally about 4 weeks before 9/11. And he was in Europe, actually, when 9/11 happened. It took him 3 days to get back, which he says gave him some time to think about what he wanted to do. And he came back and he said, for the next year, almost all of our program is going to be on this issue, not just 9/11, but what's going on in the Middle East. What is our foreign policy supposed to be? How do we respond to this? What is our role in other parts of the world besides Europe? And that was, I think, was a move of the council away from Europe. Marshall later, he himself was an Asia subcontinent expert, and he moved a lot of the council program much more towards China, much more towards India, a shift that served us well when the fighting in Afghanistan broke out. But 9/11 was the start of this shift away from this Eurocentric council policy to more of a look at the rest of the world, especially Asia and especially China and the growth of China.
In the Midwest, in 2016, you'd argue that Donald Trump ran the board, pretty much.
Yeah.
And this question of isolationism seemed to move more into the area of nationalism, didn't it?
Yes.
And so where is the council that is nonpartisan but not neutral, where does the council center itself around that period of time?
It's been very difficult, as it caused considerable soul searching. It was the people in our own backyard across the Midwest who had a lot to do with putting Donald Trump in the White House. Other parts of the country, the South and the Southeast, of course, were solid Trump. But it was states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin that swung to Republican and put Trump in. And so this was our own people, our own neighbors here, pretty much jeering at what the council does for a living. And how do we respond to this? And we are still working on this. How much do we reach out to the Midwest? How much do we try to get the Midwest back into a solid international conversation? The council is still more of an elite organization. We're not going to go out and belly up to the bar with the boys in Youngstown. That's not what we do. But how can we get our voice out there? Because the mood in the Midwest is anti-immigrant, in which the council generally favors immigration. It's done a lot of work on immigration. To a lesser degree, the mood in the Midwest is anti-trade, though there still is a strong pro-trade thing. But the council believes in open trade. The mood in the Midwest is more of a nationalism. That means being against allies and alliances, the United States, America first, that sort of thing. Whereas the council believes in a collaborative, outward foreign policy, working with allies and friends in our own national interest. So the new mood here has it's been tricky, and it's caused the council to do a lot of thinking.
When you say the council isn't going to belly up to the bar in Youngstown, we live right now in a moment of Black Lives Matter, great fissures in our cities. Is the council wide open, more so now than before, to the racial part of a discussion? Because race affects the world, not just the United States of America. How well has the council engaged in those kinds of aspects of discussion?
Very positively, I'd say, and this is a change. In doing research for the book, I realized back in 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and cities across the nation burned, and good chunks of Chicago burned also, the council in those days literally paid no attention. I could not find any indication that we'd done any programming at all on this. I think the feeling was that this was strictly a domestic issue that had nothing to do with what the council did. Now, I was based in Moscow at the time, and I remember sitting around and watching Moscow TV, which was running the race riots here in the United States practically nonstop, because it was a big propaganda coup. It really did affect our foreign policy, but this didn't dawn on the council in those days. Fast forward some years to the George Floyd murder, the reaction has been entirely different, with programming on race, on programming on the role of minorities, on looking at our own policies and hiring, in vendors, in programming, and just how the council copes with this new world. In this, obviously, we're not alone. The whole country is trying to figure out, how to cope with a world and a situation that we really didn't take as seriously in the past as we have. We've become much more diverse over the years, there's no question about that, and the programming has, but focusing on the racial situation here in the United States, no, we're doing much more of that now than we used to.
The council's audience, how would you describe the council's audience then, today versus back then?
Back then, I would go to meetings in places like the University Club, which was a little stuffy, and I'd be the youngest person there generally. It was rather stuffy. Marshall Bhutan, again, changed this a lot, I would think. He brought in, well, just changing in the programs, talking about the Middle East, talking about what was going on in the Middle East and in other countries and in Asia, tended to bring in an audience that was less European, that was younger certainly. A lot of students, we reached out to students to bring them in to try and diversify the audiences as much as we could, and with considerable success, I would say. We have other programs. The Young Professionals is one in which we try to bring in younger members, and the Emerging Leaders, which is an invitation-only selection of people like that. Two members of Congress, Sean Costin and Rajesh Krishnamurthy, are both graduates of the Emerging Leaders program. But these trying to bring in a more of a diverse group there to talk about these. So the council is very aware of this. Like a lot of older organizations, it struggles with its history, it struggles with doing this, but it's struggling in the right direction now, I'd say.
You write in the book that the council was very big on getting presidential candidates, but not so hot on getting actual presidents to show up. Why was that?
It's hard to get presidents. I mean,
I would say the New York Council might have had a couple more.
Well, the New York Council has this special status, and this has been something that we've battled against over the years. We did start life as the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, and the name was changed in 2006 to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for a number of reasons, but one reason was we were tired of being confused with that other outfit in New York. But that New York is closer, and New York does have this cachet of being a place that sets foreign policy, and to a good degree it does. It was formed after World War I, mainly because the United States didn't have a foreign policy, and it was left up to this New York organization to form this. So it has this special status. Now, we have got a lot of presidents who came as candidates or as ex-presidents. Among the speakers that we had who spoke against involvement in World War II was Herbert Hoover, who spoke on that. But we have had only two sitting presidents who've spoken to the council directly. The first one was Jerry Ford back in the mid-'70s, and the second was Barack Obama, who spoke to a council program in Washington. Obama has also spoken to the council 3 other times as a candidate, but once as president.
Joe Biden's been here, and Biden is a guy who has foreign policy chops, correct?
Yeah.
And so how was he received here at the council, and what did he have to say when he came?
Well, he's been received very well, and he should be glad to come here because we kind of got him on his way in foreign policy. Shortly after,
even though you're nonpartisan.
No,
but not neutral.
Nope. This was in 1972, I believe. He was newly elected senator. And we used to run something called the Atlantic Conferences, which were usually held in cities, Europe or the United States, to bring together leaders and future leaders. John Riley, who was running the council at the time, was a real talent scout, and he spotted some of these. He spotted Helmut Kohl when he was about 38 years old and fairly obscure. Back about that time, he got a tip that there was this young senator we ought to invite named Joe Biden, who I don't think had ever been abroad before. So they invited him. This was one of the first international conferences he went to, and maybe we bent a twig there. Biden has been back several times to speak to the council. Most recently, after he stopped being vice president, he spoke to an overflow crowd at the Palmer House. I'm sure we'd like to get him back again.
I'm sure you would.
Oh, yes.
Well, you've got a talent scout out there to kind of rustle him in, don't you?
We're working on that.
The council went broke twice. I found that a fascinating little detail. How's the council doing financially?
Council's doing fine now. Back in those, did go broke twice. First time was with the crash in 1929. Everybody went broke, and they just had to cut back on its programming. They got back on its feet. The second time was at the end of the 1950s. There was an executive director named Carter Davidson, who was a former foreign correspondent, a broadcaster, knew a lot about broadcasting, and really got us into the television age. And we were on, did a lot of television programs, especially with Channel 11, WTTW. Put on excellent programs, but didn't pay a whole lot of attention on how to pay for them. And so by the time he stepped down in 1960, the cupboard was bare. We were practically broke. So they had to do something about it, and they went out and hired a man named Edmund Ager, whose only qualification, a former advertising man, and his only qualification for the job seemed to be that his wife was on the executive committee. But he came in and he spotted that the Civil Aeronautics Board forbade airlines from running charter flights. But membership organizations could run charter flights. Of course, this is a big deal now, Alumni Association, all this, but this was fairly new back then. So Ager got us into the charter flight thing, sponsoring trips to Europe for a couple $100 off the usual price. And the only hitch was you had to be a member of the council. Well, those memberships just flowed in, and the travel program made us so much money during Ager's time that by the time the CAB closed this loophole in the mid-70s, we had it financed a lot of what we did and financed it well into the 70s. Since then, right now, the pandemic has hit our finances as it's hit everybody else. We've had no layoffs. But a lot of our funding comes from foundations. We usually charge for meetings. We haven't been able to do that recently.
Meetings have been hard too. I mean, when you bring up the pandemic, the amazing bookends of the history of the council are the Spanish flu, right before 1922, and COVID-19 now. I mean, in a strange sort of symbiotic, synergistic way, we've dealt with pandemics in your inception and in your current centenary.
That's a very weird coincidence, but there it is, yes. And it has changed. Council, like everything else, has been closed for 18 months. We would normally be doing this program for an audience. We don't do that. So what do you do instead? This has got us into the digital age in a big way. Fortunately, we have this new conference center here, named, I might mention, after Colonel McCormick.
You think he's rolling over in his grave?
Both he and a few generations of council leaders, I think. But this is due to a very generous donation from the McCormick Foundation. But with this has come a broadcasting studio that was here and brand new when the pandemic hit. So we have the facilities and we've used them to the hilt. I think we closed the office on Wednesday, and by Friday evening we were putting on digital programs. And this has enabled us to reach a new audience. One thing it's enabled us to do is to reach nationally and internationally in a way that we weren't able to do before. It's also enabled us to get in good speakers. Before, if we wanted somebody from New York or London or Washington or something like that, we'd have to fly them here at some expense, and they would have to take a couple days out of their schedule just to be here. Now that's not necessary.
To the miracle of the digital world.
Absolutely, we can reach out and contact these people, and we have. This like so much of this changing with the diversity issue, with all this. This is stuff that's happened in the past couple of years that the council is working with now, and we will see. I wrote this history of the council. I didn't write the future of the council, but you can see this history being written now.
Indeed you can. So, one last question before we go to questions from our audience. you were so thoroughgoing in all that you learned and all you knew about the council. But what is there in your book that until you began writing it, you just didn't know? Did anything surprise you in the course of this odyssey?
I think the variety of the speakers, I mean, there's a lot of drama in there, like what went on in the 1930s. I found this fascinating. The variety of the speakers. What I really found interesting, I mean, the book it's partially a history of the council as an institution, and it's partially a history of foreign events as they were heard from the council stage. So we've got all these speakers, and I've read all the speeches from the past 100 years. And they're fascinating because these are arguments being made by men and women who felt strongly about some crisis of the day, but they had no idea how this was going to come out. We know now how this works out, but it's the immediacy and the passion of these presentations that got to me, and I found that fascinating.
Anybody who's going to read this book needs to read the Margaret Thatcher part, because I was utterly glued to that. But that's kind of a tease into others reading your book. Dick Longworth, thank you so much for this conversation. Now we're going to move the conversation out to our audience. And a couple of questions. Nigel is asking, what can the council learn from the past in terms of being nonpartisan at times of divisiveness?
I think what it's learned is stick to your guns. If you follow the foreign policy of the day, if you go along with whatever the received wisdom of the day is, or the received lack of wisdom in this case, you're tampering with the character of the whole organization. The council was formed to bring in honest information, to provide clarity on foreign affairs, to let Chicagoans, very isolated in those days, realize that there's a great world out there and we have to deal with it in an intelligent way. And I think, that's what we've learned in recent years, is that, no, you don't just go along with whatever the foreign policy happens to be at the moment. For 75 years after World War II, we could kind of do that because American policy in the world synced with what the council felt was right. Donald Trump and his administration was a wake-up call.
Can you talk more, one of our guests asked, about the Vietnam era in Chicago and the council's place in those debates?
The council had a lot of debates on that, and a lot of good speeches, one of them by your brother-in-law, Gary Cutley, who was Vietnam Bureau Chief at the time. It was interesting to see in the early 1960s, our first speeches, one of them by this Carter Davidson, who had been the former executive director, very much in favor of the war. Other people, Time Magazine, we had a couple generals come in. The United States is winning, all is going fine. And then you see the tone changing. And the first time Gary Cutley spoke on this, and he spoke a couple times, first time, he was kind of hoping the United States would win, that it wasn't all that terrible, but you could see the doubt creeping in. And then as the decade wore on, with speeches from people like Senator Morse and others, hotly opposed to the war. And then we had a fairly titanic debate between Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was he's always been an apostle for an aggressive foreign policy, and Hans Morgenthau at the University of Chicago, who was more of a restraint, more of the realist foreign policy, on whether the United States should be the world policeman or not. How important was it how important was Vietnam to our national security? What places were important to us? What did we have to learn about this? So the debates and the speeches through the 60s I found fascinating.
Did the council miss an opportunity in building bridges to the Trump administration?
No, we tried. We really tried. It was impossible. Dan Coates, who was director of national security, came here and spoke to a private dinner of the council. And that is the only Trump administration official we were able to get, not for want of trying, but they just didn't want to come here. They didn't see the point. I think they're allergic to organizations like ours. They're allergic to cities. I don't know, but no, it's not for want of trying, but we did not hear from them, and that's bad because we should be hearing from both sides. But what can we do?
Though to echo, I know in my years at WTTW Chicago Tonight, and during those campaigns, we tried desperately to get Trump election officials to come on, talk about the campaign, the managers, the delegates, and finally one of them said to me after the election, "We were told not to talk to you."
Okay.
So I think it was not just the council that was being rejected. Has the council, this is another question, has the council's need to raise money ever conflicted with its nonpartisan position?
No, we have a policy on that, and it's an ethics policy. A lot of organizations have the same, that we will take money from organizations. We very seldom take money from foreign governments, but we do take money from various organizations with their own, we know what their political persuasion is.
Under what circumstance would you take money from a foreign government?
I think we may have in the past, but very carefully. But the idea is, the whole point is, we will take money from you to do a project that you want done because you think that we will do a good job on it. But you have no say in how this is done. You do not have any input in this project. You don't get to read it before it comes out. We're glad for the money, but we are going to give you a good product, and that's the reward for your money. But this, you have to put this wall down to keep donors from writing your projects, writing your reports. Other World Affairs Councils and think tanks have gotten into trouble in this, so this is the reason for this policy.
Another question, how representative has the council been of the wider Midwest? You and I were, before we even embarked on this, we're talking about who is really a farmer in Illinois, and they're pretty sophisticated people, though sometimes the two coasts don't see the Midwest in that way. How representative has the council been of the wider Midwest?
Not as representative as it should have been. We were started back in 1922. We were kind of an alliance between North Shore grandees and the intellectual firepower down at the University of Chicago. And it remains that sort of an organization. Our members are people who are really deeply involved in foreign affairs, are very interested, and want a greater knowledge and thoughtfulness than they get on the day-by-day thing. Reaching out to the rest of the Midwest has been a problem. There are World Affairs Councils in other cities in the Midwest, some good, some not so good. We've worked with some of them, but reaching out takes time, it takes money, it takes an organizational structure that is very hard to come by. Reaching out to the rest of the city has been a question. What do we do? How do we reach out to the west side? And the
How do you
south
go
side?
to Englewood,
Yeah.
or, right?
Yeah, we've tried that. It is very hard. We are not a service organization, but that raises the question: what are we? What responsibility do we have? In the past, we've done work in schools, and I think there is a role that we could do there, because the whole city needs to know. We live in a global city. And what goes on in this city is affected day in and day out by what goes on around the world. And the whole city needs to be brought in touch with that and realize that. Now we did a number of papers called Heartland Papers, which was on immigration, on biofuels, on the role of higher education in the Midwest. I did this book while I was here at the council on the Midwest, Caught in the Middle, on the impact of globalization on the Midwest. So we have tried to do this. We're working hard now on with old industrial cities, the old industrial cities around the Midwest and the old industrial cities in Western Europe, both of whom have declined for largely the same reasons, with somewhat the same impact, that is populism and a swing to the right in the politics. What do you do about this?
What do you do about this? So another question, is being based in Chicago a strength for the council, or are we a little too out of the way for policymakers?
It's a strength because we don't compete with the Brookings of the world or the New York Council. They are there, right there. They talk to each other all the time, and if you talk to them, you learn very quickly that all wisdom and all knowledge is locked up inside the Beltway, and what the peasants out there beyond the Beltway know doesn't count for anything. And our point is that all wisdom and all knowledge is not locked up in the Beltway, that we know an awful lot here about foreign affairs and foreign policy that, by God, the nation ought to hear about. Our voice should be heard when when policy is being made. In the Middle East, well, maybe not so much. We don't have a natural advantage on that. But in trade, in immigration, in global cities, in transport, these issues, these are big global issues. The pandemic, healthcare, that sort of stuff. We know things. We have experience. We have a voice, and the council sees it as its role to make this voice heard. In certain areas, like American agricultural policy towards the third world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we pretty much wrote the administration's bill on that with some money from the Gates Foundation that wanted us to do a report that was adopted by the Obama administration and later by the Trump administration. And we have an office in Washington now that really does push these issues. Things that we know about, things that we have a comparative advantage. That's what we like to talk about. And if Washington doesn't hear us, they aren't getting the news.
Well, that happens sometimes.
Yeah, it does.
So you talk about how important women were to the council, but one question that comes across the transom is, when do you think then we might see a woman lead the council?
Well, you have to look back to 1942, when Louise Wright took over, and she led the council.
Did she lead? I thought she was not the top person in the council. I thought she was a second person in the council. Is that incorrect?
No, you have the board. Back then, the board was called the Executive Committee, and then you had the council itself, and that gets confusing. So let me just say, you have the board on one hand, and you have the council here. You have a chairman of the board. Leah Zell was the first chair of that board. And then you have the council, which is run on its day-to-day activities, and that's run by the president. Ivo Dalder is the president now. Louise Wright was the president back in those days.
All right.
Which does not really answer the question, when are we going to have another one?
When are you going to have another one?
I don't know. Not a bad idea.
Not a bad, or as an African American ever led the council?
No, hasn't. And not a bad idea.
Or an Hispanic American?
No.
Asian American?
No.
There's room for growth here.
You said it.
What decade, finally, do you believe was most transformative for the council, and dovetailing that into that decade, in fact, kind of a reason to be optimistic for the council in the coming century?
2 decades, I would say. One was the 30s, when your father-in-law ran it. And this established the council in Chicago. It was the focus of this life and death debate. Do we go to war or don't we? And the council was really on the spear point of that. The second decade, I would say, probably would be the first decade of this century after 9/11, when the council expanded its view beyond Europe to take in Asia and also a lot of these issues, such as immigration, that the council hadn't dealt with before. And at the same time, expanded its staff, expanded its facilities, it grew in so many ways. This is not to say that everybody has contributed something to the council as they go through, but if you ask me to pick 2 decades.
And based on all of that, just a yes or no, are you optimistic about the next century with the council?
Am I optimistic about the next century, or am I optimistic about the council?
Let's try each one.
Okay.
Are you optimistic, I guess, for the council's work in the next century?
Yes, I am. because no matter what goes on, I'm not, it'd be foolish to be too optimistic about the next century. Looking back at what happened in the last century since the council was formed, bad things happen. But the council, through all this, has a role to play. And it does have this nonpartisan, but not neutral.
Not neutral?
But not neutral stance. It has a lodestar here. As long as it follows that and does what it's in business to do, yes, I'm optimistic.
Dick Longworth, Chicago and the world, it's been a pleasure.
Carol, thank you.
I wish I could see everybody out there, but I cannot. But thank all of you who've been watching from Zoom. We're so grateful.